I'm Amber Duke,
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Will Chamberlain.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Today, we're not going to have our normal four different topics followed by final thoughts because I think for us, there's really only one thing worth talking about, which is the political assassination of Charlie Kirk. We're going to get into all of the details that we know so far about the shooting, as well as the political, cultural ramifications, and really everything in between. So, just to kick us off, I'll start with sort of the facts on the ground as we know them. Charlie was doing an event at Utah Valley University through Turning Point USA when a 22-year-old suspected assassin, and I say suspected because Tyler Robinson is the person that has been arrested for the crime, but we'll use allegedly as suspected until he's convicted. Um, from a rooftop across from where Charlie Kirk was set up under a tent, fired a shot that struck Charlie in the neck. Um, Charlie was later pronounced dead at the hospital, and the shooter was apprehended about 2 days later after two arrests of individuals who they believed were the suspect, who ended up not having anything to do with the actual shooting. Although one individual, we have since learned from a report, deliberately apparently turned himself in as the shooter in order to distract law enforcement from finding the actual suspect. The individual who was accused of doing the shooting, Tyler Robinson, had apparently escaped, according to surveillance video, by jumping off of the roof that he is suspected of shooting Charlie from, dropped his rifle and ammunition casings containing anti-fascist messaging engraved on them in a nearby bush, had messaged his roommate, who was allegedly transgender, asking him to pick up the rifle. His father later recognized him from surveillance footage released by the FBI, told his pastor friend that he believed his son was the shooter and had confessed to him. The pastor then called the authorities, who were able to pick up Robinson, and he has been in custody since and is reportedly not cooperating with law enforcement, although friends and family around him have been and have said that he had become more political in recent years and had subscribed to leftist ideology, believed that Charlie Kirk was a hateful person, and that he was a fascist. So, with all of that, just a general overview of what we know. I know for all of us, this is a very difficult episode to film. I believe all of us probably knew Charlie personally, maybe had done his podcast or participated in Turning Point events. He was kind of a larger than life figure in the conservative movement, was responsible for really, I think, making conservatism mainstream among young people in a lot of ways, hosting events for high school and college students that routinely had thousands of attendees, was constantly going into the lion's den and having debates and discussions with people who did hate him, and hated everything that he stood for. He also was someone who leaned very heavily on faith. In fact, when he was asked about what he wanted his legacy to be earlier this year, he said that he actually hoped it was his Christian faith in God that he wanted to be his legacy. He was able to build friendships with people across the conservative movement, whether it was the NatCons or the populists, all the way over to the neoconservatives, and was very courageous. And I think most people believe that the hole that he leaves behind in the conservative movement will be difficult, if not impossible, to fill. So I think if people want to start just by sharing, kind of who Charlie was, what his role was in the conservative movement, and a little bit about the legacy he leaves behind, then we can move into some of the political and cultural questions that we've seen in the aftermath later on.
I guess I'll start. I kind of got introduced to Charlie on a personal level in around late 2019, early 2020, when he was in the middle of the first Groyper War nonsense with Nick Fuentes. I remember that we met in Florida. He invited me to the Turning Point compound in Arizona, and I actually got to spend a really good amount of time with him over the course of about 2 to 3 days. We were sort of working on business stuff related to human events, and ended up coming, he ended up bringing in one of his donors and investors in as like a partner for human events. That partnership didn't work out particularly well, but it was, one small example of the kind of thing he loved to try and do. He was a diplomat. He was a person who brought people together. He wanted to move the ball forward in any number of ways, bring people into kind of his orbit, and then push them to do more. It always struck one of the things that struck me is in person, he was remarkably thoughtful and pragmatic. Even then, I think maybe that became more obvious over time to a lot of people, but then it was really obvious to me that the caricature of Charlie that a lot of people had didn't reflect the man at all. At the time, he reminded me of the most talented big law partners I knew from my time in big law. One of these people who's intellectually extremely gifted, but also a ridiculously hard worker. And those are the people to me that I was like, Charlie could have succeeded at anything he wanted to do. When you combine both a formidable intellect and just an astonishing work ethic. I think one story he told during that time was, and I don't know a lot of people who know this, he had real back problems. And one of the reason he had back problems is because he was a really, really dedicated distance runner for a long time and really addicted to the runner's high. And as a result of just kind of pushing and pushing and pushing himself, ended up having all these back problems. And you kind of analogize that to the rest of his life. You sort of get it. He's one of these people who just worked flat out, all the time. But that didn't stop him also from being a wonderful family man, as we saw, his touching tribute to, or the way he treated Erica and his children I can't help but feel for them. It's just horrible, what happened to Erica and the kids. So I don't know. And I always felt like, Charlie and I in the last few years, we didn't talk that often, but then the guy's one of the busiest men in the world. It's one of those things where I'd go on a show occasionally if I had, he'd always keep an eye on if I had something interesting where I was doing research, like the Abrego Garcia case, for instance, which is the last time I went on a show. But I never always felt like, and I'm sure many, many of you felt the same way, which is if I needed something from Charlie, I could give him a call, or I could give Andrew a call and something would happen. The Turning Point people and Charlie himself were very dedicated to the health of the movement, were extremely generous with their time, were incredible diplomats. And it's a real loss. It's not easy to not an easily replaceable person, if he's replaceable at all. And I mean, to think he managed to accomplish all this, make him put himself really at the center of the conservative movement and the most effective evangelist of our views and ideas to young people. And he did that by the age of 31. He's 8 years younger than me. Crazy. An unbelievable talent, an unbelievably high quality human being, and a real tragedy that he's gone.
Yeah, I was thinking about the words, and Will, you really hit home with a good description for me of thoughtful and pragmatic. I feel like what I was going to say is something very related, which is both he was like intellectually thoughtful, but extremely dedicated to the fight and like making wins happen. And those two things don't usually combine very often, I find, right? You have people who are really like raw, make actual political wins happen. And then you have people who are sort of thoughtful. And there is much to be said that we have, on the right, we have too many chattering classes and not enough like winners and actual political organizers. And it was rare to see both of those things in the same person. And Charlie was really, really good at both. The hole that he's going to leave behind in the movement, and I know we'll get to that. And that's why some of the descriptions are so irritating. And in some ways, I don't know what the right word is for it, but even people who are trying to, trying to do the right thing and actually condemning this violence, the way that he's being described as like a shock jock or provocateur, I think it is a real insult to how he operated. And also, second, what Will said, he was an extremely busy man, but I asked him for something only once, like in our, I knew him through Claremont, through whatever. I'm sure we all knew him a little bit, at least. Um, but I asked him for some help on behalf of my husband's family friend, who was at January 6th and was one of the people who was caught up in some of these prosecutions. And like he came through on that, like, he made sure that the right people knew, and he made sure that, the guy's name was on the pardon list. And I don't know, I'm sure he's done many, many things like that for people behind the scenes, and he would never shirk from doing those things. He was irreplaceable in the conservative movement. And I don't know what we're gonna do without him.
Yeah, I will cabin my remarks on the ghoulish responses and such later because the positives in Charlie's life so vastly outweigh all of the negative and evil people who have reacted as they have or tried to exploit this situation in the way they have. And talk a little bit about the kind of macro influence of Charlie, and then the more micro and just personal observations. It's worth noting. I often think a lot about the founding fathers and how much they were able to achieve and contribute at such young ages, and there are very few people like Charlie, who at 31, I mean, millions of people will not be able to achieve a fraction of what he achieved just by 31 years old. And you think about losses of conservative leaders, or you think about contributions of conservatives, outside of our political class. And even though Charlie wasn't, um, an intellectual in the classical sense, like a William F. Buckley would have been, or a radio host in the way that Rush Limbaugh was, he sort of melded those different talents of, this was someone who was an everyday American on the one hand, an autodidact, which I think is worth noting. I mean, maybe it's better that he didn't get the college education because maybe it would have corrupted him. But he was self-taught in many ways, which is incredibly impressive. And he was able to blend an intellectual, deep understanding of ideas as well as the practical, the politics, as has been articulated here, to become a leader of a movement, a uniter in a movement, and impact hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Um, and my last personal message to him, and we didn't correspond frequently, but he was generous enough to have me on his show at length a number of times, which he didn't have to do, which I always greatly appreciated. But my last interaction with him one-on-one outside of the show was after the 2024 election, saying, congratulations, you slayed Goliath basically with your get out the vote effort. And the get out the vote effort in 2024 and rallying and mobilizing younger voters was just a fraction of what he ultimately contributed in a space when it comes to the campuses that has been so hostile and adverse to this movement for so many generations. First interaction with him was actually 5+ years ago when I did a media hit on my book, American Ingrate, and he somehow got my number and sent me a message and was incredibly complimentary. And I think that from what I've seen, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories just like that of him being incredibly thoughtful, considerate, gracious, and generous with his time, his energy, and his support. And that's really a model citizen and a model human being and a moral human being in the truest sense. So, I think about losses, and there's almost nothing comparable. And obviously, part of it's the influence. Like, I think about Andrew Breitbart leaving us way too soon, but this is in some ways on another level because this is a movement leader, and you need all of these different types of elements in any sort of movement. But irreplaceable is certainly an accurate word. And obviously, this hits close to home, I assume, for all of us, because look, we're young people with young families, and this is someone who was just like us, who was out in the fight, in intellectual battle. He was doing it the right way. And the other side's response essentially is to say, we're not willing to debate. We're not willing to persuade. We're not willing to use reason. we have to use force to overcome you. And that includes not just mass censorship or weaponizing of authorities against you, but it actually means using bodily force and physically silencing you by taking you off this earth. And it's one thing when you have assassination attempts on political leaders, and it's another thing when you have a citizen who, granted, himself was a political leader and was one of the most powerful and influential and effective people in this movement, I think in no small part because the other side couldn't belittle him. They couldn't attack him or marginalize him on the merits. And so they've had to lie and gaslight about it now. But he was a model citizen, a model warrior in this fight. And in my view, and we'll probably talk about this a little more at length, one of the lessons is to be just as courageous as him. The other side will want to use this to strike fear and instill fear in anyone and everyone who dares to speak out. And I think by trying to silence Charlie, ultimately they are going to awaken millions. And I'm sure you've seen this. I've seen anecdotally, at least, among people who are apolitical, especially those who have observed the responses to Charlie's death, his murder. Yeah, this has awakened people in a way that other movements have not, that other events have not necessarily catalyzed. And I think it struck a chord with normies and beyond, quote unquote, around this country. And then the other aspect beyond the fact that he should serve as a model and should instill courage in anyone and everyone who cares about defending this republic, is that the networks on the other side, as Stephen Miller and others have talked to, who fundraise, who propagandize on behalf of, who organize for, who train, who fuel, etc., a movement of political violence. Those networks need to be dismantled and deconstructed consistent with the law. And that is the only justifiable response to a movement that increasingly, particularly when you look at the polls, believes that political violence is the answer. Ultimately, we can't tolerate that in this country, and so that requires, of course, prudence and judgment in how you defend and protect our liberties. And part of defending and protecting our liberties is prosecuting and pursuing to the fullest extent those who would try to exploit and abuse those liberties to threaten the livelihood of people who just have the utter gall to disagree with them. So, Charlie serves as a model, and now we need to pick up the banner, pick up the torch, and more vigorously and aggressively pursue the kinds of aims, both the principles, the high-minded principles and ideals, as well as the blocking and tackling necessary to achieve them, the path that he had laid out for us.
I want to pick up on the citizenship thread, and because what Charlie was doing was very directly the only way forward as a citizen, right? I think people so quickly forget that politics is the replacement for war and for violence, right? Like actual dialogue and discussion is not, people think of it as like this kumbaya, like, oh, like, and I hate that kind of, honestly, I hate that kind of fake, both sides, have to come together and talk, and as though that will solve the problem. That's not what Charlie was doing. It is that is a combat of ideas because people believe so strongly in opposing things. And citizens believe so strongly in opposing things. If we cannot do it Charlie's way, it will be violence. Like, and I don't know, we forget that, I guess, because we live in a, less, especially in America, we've had a continuous government for so long that, what happens when Charlie's way no longer works is war and violence. And one side's already there. A large part of one side is already there. I don't want to say everybody on the left is, but a large part of one side is already there.
Yeah. It's remarkable to me how many people celebrated his passing. And even this morning, I mean, I don't know if you guys saw this, but the top charge in the Luigi Mangione case got dismissed, which was actually apparently not too much of a legal surprise, just because there's a similar issue we can talk about with like the aggravated murder charge against Robinson in Utah that's probably going to have similar issues. But the reason I bring that up is because you had a whole bunch of people outside celebrating, saying "Free Luigi," and I'm just sitting there, what? Free Luigi, guy on tape murdering somebody in cold blood, a father with kids. Free him, really? And I see the same thing from huge chunks of the left, that various forms of celebration, happy he's dead, it just complete ghoulishness. And I look at these people and I think, well, you guys are really the enemies of public order, and I don't think you have any idea what you might want to summon into existence. And kind of, one more point here is I hear, obviously there's this enormous effort on the right on social media to impose employment consequences on people who are celebrating his death, getting people fired throughout public and private employment. And I hear from some squishy people on the right that, oh, this is right-wing cancel culture. You're doing to them what they did to you. I mean, obviously, there's the first point, which is the left. We told the left cancel culture is bad, and they didn't care, and they kept doing it anyway. So I'm not about to unilaterally disarm on that front. But more importantly, cancel culture was about people expressing views within the Overton window being targeted for that expression of just a policy view, and then getting removed from their positions. It wasn't about people celebrating political assassination. And all you have to do is just game out the results of what happens if political assassination becomes normalized in this country, where maybe not everybody's going to assassinate somebody, but 15 to 20% of the population is going to cheer them on and support them. What does that world look like? It looks like a world with a lot more political assassinations, and that's Algeria, that's Spain, that's civil. That's the kind of thing that genuinely does lead to civil war. At a certain point, if the political faction in charge of the country continuously sees its leaders getting executed, it will have to treat that as equivalent to a civil war and do things like suspend habeas corpus and throw people in jail. And who knows what happens after that. But it certainly leads to a very different kind of government than the one we have, a very different kind of society than the one we have, and a much worse one. And so, as such, I think it's really, really important that we maintain a very strong social sanction and social stigma on people who would publicly celebrate the assassination of a domestic political figure they disagree with.
Yeah, and I think to be clear about Charlie's legacy and what he believed in, yes, free speech, but also truth and moral clarity. Right? I mean, the idea that a doctor or a nurse in an emergency room or a teacher, I mean, that's really the bulk of the people that we have seen celebrating and fired for celebrating are people who work in either the healthcare industry or the educational industry. People who actually do need to have basic moral standards and compassion and empathy in order to do their jobs properly. I mean, I thought about yesterday, I was talking about this with my husband, that old Reagan joke after his attempted assassination of how he hoped that the doctor was a Republican. And like he was joking, but now it's not a joke anymore. Now it's very real. Where if you see, I saw someone from my high school who works in a military hospital posting all of this whataboutism and saying, well, Charlie didn't deserve it, but and explaining how he created the hate that led to his death. I mean, it's legitimately at a point where, as a conservative, you have to worry about someone in a position of power, someone in a position of social services, finding out that you're a conservative and perhaps offering you a different standard of care than a liberal who goes in to get a surgery. I mean, that's what this is instructing me about. I also just wanted to mention the whataboutism and some of the gaslighting that's been going on, just on a national level. In the aftermath of this, we have a plurality of Americans who believe that the shooter was a registered Republican, according to a YouGov poll that was released this week, because we have mainstream media outlets insisting that we don't have a motive or we don't know the motive. We have left-wing substackers claiming that the guy was a groyper who hated Charlie because he wasn't fascist enough. Because groypers run around calling people fascist, like on their bullet casings, and talk about hate. it's just ridiculous. We've had people doing the whataboutism with the Melissa Hortman Minnesota murder, which apparently was done by someone who was probably schizophrenic and believed that he was actually carrying out a mission for Democratic Governor Tim Walz, but apparently we're supposed to believe he was some massive right-winger who was radicalized by conservatism. Um, the burning down of Josh Shapiro's home has also been mentioned, as if that wasn't obviously a pro-Palestinian person who was upset that the governor is Jewish and supportive of Israel. And it doesn't take going back that far to have a very compelling list of left-wing violence, from the 2017 Alexandria baseball shooting that nearly killed Steve Scalise, to assassination attempts on Donald Trump, riots the entire summer of 2020 that killed multiple individuals, including police officers and people who were merely trying to protect their storefronts.
Threats to judges,
Yeah,
including
Brett
Supreme Court
Kavanaugh,
judges.
attempted assassination attempt on Brett Kavanaugh. Like, it's just not comparable to me. And I appreciate
It's
that
not
JD
comparable,
Vance.
and it's connected directly to ideology,
Yes.
right? I mean, you say 2017, the left has 100 years of celebrating political violence. Like, you talk about threats to judges, Ben. Angela Davis is still popular on college campuses.
Yeah.
Like, this is not, they put Che's face on their shirts, who wrote about how much he enjoyed shooting people in the head.
It's
Like,
not fringe. It's really not fringe.
Frantz Fanon in Wretched, right, writes about how the oppressed can only become a man and worthy of respect to himself when he feels the blood of his oppressors on his hands. This is like part of the ideology, and there's this ridiculous notion that we're supposed to imagine that all political ideologies sort of had the same propensity to violence. Like, yes, at some point there are always some crazies on everybody's team, but then they try to pull out these statistics that I'm seeing online of pie charts, which, a whole different story is the leftist fetish, frankly, for putting their political premises into a bar graph and then pointing to it and saying this is objective, like as though it's any different because it's in a pie chart as opposed to stating things. But like, if you actually look at how they're classifying left-wing and right-wing violence in those, all white nationalists, of course, are considered right-wing violence. But Black nationalists, they're not considered left-wing violence. They categorize it right-wing political violence, a homeless man who shouted a slur when he tried to hit somebody on the head. Okay, and same thing with like there are quite a few incidents in New York City of Black people, basically coming up behind Orthodox Jews and hitting them with something on the head. That's categorized as right-wing violence. Like, there is no honesty.
Like inner gang skinhead killings. They call those right-wing violence. It's
let's also note the irony that it's the right that owns the guns in this country, and it's the left that has the propensity for this violence. While they want to take away the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, while they believe in depolicing so that you are defenseless, while criminals that they believe in decarcerating and coddling are the ones illegally obtaining guns and threatening people. So you have no way to defend yourself, of course, in a blue jurisdiction. It's only basically the favored classes among the blue anons and the blues in this country who are able to be armed and to wreak havoc and chaos and violence on the country. And let's also note, of course, that January 6th, the one seminal event that they tried to exploit to cast the right as domestic terrorists and everyone in MAGA is violent and on the cusp of civil war. Not one person, I believe, arrested on Capitol grounds or prosecuted had a firearm on them. This among a political movement that believes staunchly in the Second Amendment and probably that was disproportionately comprised of gun owners. Not one single gun fired by any one of those people on January 6th. Of course, it was only one of the protesters / rioters who was shot that day.
Yeah, one point I'd make on this, the right just lost maybe its most prominent influential person that it has in Charlie Kirk, right? If you saw he is extremely impactful, one of our biggest figures, top 5 for sure. Were there any boarded up windows anywhere in this country? Anybody worried about riots? Not once. Not once. you people actually, if the left seriously thought that the right was just as violent as they were, every single city in this country would have been boarded up like crazy, knowing that riots were coming. But they knew they weren't coming because they know the right is peaceful, that the right doesn't do these things. Batya had a really good take on this when all this both sides nonsense on, I think she was on News Nation, but she had a great take where she pointed out that the demand that the right simply take the hand extended in unity without any apology, without any, and agree, and essentially require us to co-sign the idea that we are somehow guilty for the death of Charlie Kirk, right? Essentially taking half of the responsibility. It's like, no, actually, we are the peaceful ones. Charlie was the beacon of peacefulness and of civility and of discussion. But as a movement as a whole, that is us. And the idea that you're just like, oh, unity now. Oh, really? No, actually. And that doesn't mean I want people to go out and riot. Of course not. Rioting is a fundamentally left-wing phenomenon, as I just demonstrated by the fact that nobody's boarding up their buildings in downtown districts. But what we will demand and what we will insist on is the full-throated and aggressive use of public authority to imprison and to convict and imprison the enemies of public order. That is what we will demand, and that is what we will achieve. That is this is, to the extent the left has demanded a revolution, we will impose a counter-revolution. We will use public authority, and we will restore order to this country.
Well,
I don't know if you guys saw JD Vance's sort of guest hosting of Charlie's podcast yesterday, but his closing 13 minutes, I believe it was, his closing monologue was pretty pitch perfect. And he brought up exactly this point that Will is making, which is we have no requirement, morally or otherwise, to seek unity with people who want us dead. I mean, that's really the bottom line. And I think Ben alluded to this earlier, but with all of us being conservative commentators, knowing how many people who we grew up with or are sort of acquaintances with who are cheering on the death of someone who believes a lot of the same things that we believe in, has made a lot of the same career moves as us, similar age to us, is very radicalizing and kind of scary. To know that if this happened to one of us, that people would think that it was something worth being happy about. And I was thinking about this earlier today, and I know this will resonate with you all too. But back in 2018, when Bree Payton passed from meningitis, there were a significant number of online leftists who intoned that she deserved it because she was allegedly against vaccines, which was not even true, but it didn't matter, right? Because the idea was we have to come up with some reason why it's justifiable to think that it's good that a conservative is dead.
Yeah, that's a good point. About where people stand on this, I think Douglas Murray had a really good point after he said a great phrase after October 7th. He said, sometimes a flare goes up and you should take note of where people are. When that flare goes up, you shouldn't ignore it. And what we saw is exactly what Amber said, that there are, again, not the entire left, but a not insubstantial portion of the left who would cheer for our death. And
yeah, our death, right?
The
people in this chat, our death.
Yes, that all of us. The only difference between us and Charlie Kirk is that he was more effective and, even more prominent, and that made him a bigger target. And this goes to the point about like the shock jock or provocateur or whatever. Charlie was very much not a provocateur. He wasn't saying things just for shock value. And so, and what's funny is that everybody kind of acknowledges this, right? Or at least many people on the left will acknowledge, that, his method was civil debate, right? So what is actually provoking about Charlie Kirk? It's his views. It's his views that were shared with millions and millions of Americans, including the 4 people in this chat. That's what is either outright being cited as justification for what was done to him and his family, or at least cited as justification for why he somehow provoked it, or he was exchanging in hate or whatever. It's just the mere fact of his views, right? They'll say, oh, he disagreed with gay marriage. Okay, or he said something about the fact that, you know, women would be happier being mothers than in the corporate environment. Like those are things that we believe in this podcast too, and that we say out loud too. So what was considered provoking about Charlie Kirk was merely the fact that he expressed what we believe directly, openly, and in civil debate. And that I'm never going to unsee the fact that, you know, that flare went up, and there were a lot of people in this country who think that that is either worthy of a bullet or at minimum one step back from that, then it's kind of like a provoking act to be a conservative who believes in these things, and that if violence happens to you, well, you know, it was kind of your fault.
And we warned years ago, and you know, I'm not going to put a number on it, but one of the things that conservatives have been warning about the radical leftism, and particularly on college campuses, was this trend of equating speech to violence. Anodyne conservative opinions were marketed by the left as requiring a safe space, as requiring trigger warnings, as actually mentally damaging the person who hears them, or invoking some kind of physical traumatic response. Well, what's the obvious logical conclusion of that? If you believe that speech can physically harm someone, then you committing an act of violence against them is merely self-defense. And that's what the left believes.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to, first of all, their view on speech. Words are violent, so actually, violence in response to words that hate speech, which is really speech they hate, is justifiable, and you can silence people by force because your words inflict so much harm. But I do think it is worth emphasizing the point that Inez made before, which is that there's a heritage of violence on the left, and that's ultimately where leftism leads, because they feel they have to impose their views upon us, whether they think it's for our own good or because they want to seize total power. At the end of the day, it always pushes in the direction of, you're going to agree with us at the point of a gun. You know, someone kind of flippantly said, you know, basically, if you believe in that sort of view, congratulations, you're the Taliban. And this is where the left and the jihadists of the world really unite perfectly, because they do believe in imposing their views at the point of the gun. You can look to today's violence. You can look back at the 1970s, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of bombings that were left-wing bombings, including, by the way, of the Capitol, of course. So this is
And
the
those
heritage
people are
that,
now college professors and invited to speak. I just, sorry to interrupt you, but those people are still honored. Barack Obama did not have to denounce Bill Ayers to become president.
well, but it's notable also that they became quote unquote educators, right? And it was the quote unquote educators who were disproportionate in terms of the ghoulish comments. They're indoctrinators. This is why the left went for the schools in the first place. And the schools are the hotbeds of radicalism ultimately. And then that propagates and perpetuates itself in what we see in uncivil society that we have today. And also, I think, in the fact that such a disproportionate percentage, and even if it's a percent of the entire country, you know, we're still talking tens or hundreds of thousands or more of people, but whose brains have been totally broken by politics, and their religion is leftism. They are as zealot. Their zealotry knows no bounds, essentially, and they're willing to take up arms, sometimes in the most cowardly ways, to impose their views. So, you know, this is the legacy ultimately of the Bill Ayers and the Angela Davises and the myriad other radical leftists of the 70s, who of course, you know, were the followers of the socialists and the communists from abroad, generations prior. The legacy is a generation or multiple generations, some percentage of whom their brains have been totally broken by politics. And then when you combine it, of course, with the legacy media influence and legitimizing and justifying essentially of it, the political leaders who further stir the pot, and then of course, you know, the drugs and the medication and all the other issues with our society. It's a toxic brew that's going to lead to more and more of these unstable individuals and debilitating outcomes, I think, for the country. Even if there is the vigorous action, the robust action, and the necessary action needed to try and dismantle and destroy the infrastructure that fuels this. And I say this, by the way, and I'm always careful. I try to choose my words carefully here. The individuals who carry out these acts are responsible for these acts. But it's undeniable that there is a climate in which the views that they subscribe to are amplified, are legitimized, and create the conditions such that it's only natural that if you say, and if you were exposed to every single day the messaging of the other side is consists of Nazis every single day over and over again, well, what wouldn't you do to stop the Nazis? And that is why we are where we are today.
It's a permission structure for murder,
Yeah.
is what it is. And I agree with you that only one person is responsible for pulling the trigger. And, it's funny because they accused the right after the JFK assassination, another assassination by a leftist, by a communist. They said it was the climate of hate in Dallas, right? Like, but there is a climate of hate. It's a permission structure for that percentage of people who are either unstable or are just that politically dedicated. It's a permission structure for violence against the right.
Yeah, I think we should talk about where we go next in terms of Charlie's legacy, but first I just wanted to bring up too it in terms of the other people who cheer this on or are involved in it in some way. There was, I believe, a New York Times report earlier this week that included some of the leaked Discord chat messages from the alleged shooter, and it sounds like a handful, if not more people either knew that he was going to do something or he said he was going to do something and they sort of wrote it off as a joke. But it seems like there's a group of people who saw something and didn't say something, and the FBI is looking at holding them accountable too. To move to this next portion, I wanted to start with Erica Kirk's really stunning and moving public address, which she did, I believe, just a few days after Charlie passed. It was a Friday night. And first of all, the strength and courage for her to do that was just unfathomable. But she said something really important, which is that we're not giving up, not rolling over. The cries of this widow will echo like a battle cry throughout the nation. Turning Point's social media presence has grown significantly. They've been getting a massive amount of donations, thousands of students reaching out to ask how they can start their own Turning Point chapter. And even more broadly, I see, separate from the squishy conservatives who are doing the rah rah kumbaya, there's a lot of people who I think similar to it's similar to, I think, the Kavanaugh accusations, but tenfold, because the consequences are so much more serious, where people are identifying this as a radicalizing event. And far from cowering in fear or hiding, I think a lot of people have been charged with and inspired to actually speak with more clarity, more vociferously, and to refuse to back down. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what specifically that looks like and how the conservative movement even begins to try to fill this gap.
Yeah, it's kind of that's an interesting problem. It's on us to do more. I realize that I should be doing more stuff. Whatever projects I'm involved in, I'm not giving as much time as I could to the movement and to the political cause. I could be doing more, and I think that's a really good call to action for anybody. I was really impressed and blown away by Erica Kirk's speech. It was remarkable. I'd seen bits and pieces of her, and I met her briefly, I think, one time when I did Timcast with Charlie. But didn't know the depth of her power and her strength. That was an incredibly strong speech, and it's easy to just pass over it because there's so much other awfulness about all this. But that poor family, her poor children, having to explain to a 3-year-old where daddy went just kills me because my kids are their age, the kids that they have. I have a 3.5-year-old and a newborn, and they had a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I don't even know what my wife would have to do, and what a struggle it would be for our family if I wasn't there. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. And then, to gloss over that, as so many leftists do, and who are happy about the death of, it's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. It makes me angry every time I think about it.
I noticed, by the way, that contrary to the Annunciation School shooting, that the left suddenly isn't telling us not to do thoughts and prayers, which is kind of interesting because I thought, I mean, they told us that they don't work. So if they seemingly believe that we're all wasting our time doing thoughts and prayers, so why would they tell us to stop, I guess?
Yeah, but they're blaming gun violence again. They're like,
Yeah, for the hunting rifle.
right. Yeah, for a 30-06 rifle
Right.
that's legal in England. Right.
Yeah,
They're blaming
exactly.
they're blaming gun violence for this.
I
just
killed my
as-
first deer with a 30-06 when I was 7 years old. Like, these people don't.
as though there's no distinction between a
Right.
political assassination and a more garden variety murder, and no distinction as to the consequences and the effect on the body politic. Or the lovely argument that people like Kyle Kalinske made, that you said that some amount of gun violence deaths are essentially the costs that society pays for the right to bear arms, and that the right to bear arms is a protection against tyranny. Well, having said that, you should, you don't really have any grounds to object to being murdered. That's basically Kyle Kalinske and a huge chunk of the left's argument. What an offensive and silly argument. And I guess the left is full of offensive and silly arguments in the aftermath of his death, because there is no compelling argument for their rhetoric or for anything that they've been putting forward, or for the conduct of their base, of their voters, of their politicians. There's no excuse for any of it. And I think some of them deep in their hearts know damn well there's no excuse for any of it. And that, but the only real silver lining here is I think that most of normal people in the right have recognized the threat that they face. And I think we're about to have the trivial silver lining in the context of this tragedy is I think we're about to beat the left into a pulp at the future elections, that we're about to win like crazy, because I don't think any normal people have any time for any of this.
Well, I mean, I think that's, to put two sort of pessimistic points about the future and how we move forward after this. I mean, I agree with you, Amber. There's a huge response, but there's two things. One, I think this tactic is going to increase because they are losing some of that institutional support. The left's institutional networks are finally, for the first time in my political lifetime, in all of our political lifetimes, are actually being strained and being defunded and being called, and being prosecuted. And that unfair advantage, the way that I like how Ben laid out earlier about the different forms of force. They had institutional force, so they didn't need direct political assassination. But now that they're losing the institutional force, I think we should probably sadly expect that this kind of violence will increase. And the other thing is that this will really strain. It will require everyone's effort to do more, as Will said, because this is really going to strain conservative organizations. The cost of security of doing events, they didn't have to put, I'm sure that Charlie had great security, but they had security for maybe somebody taking a pot shot from the crowd, people bum rushing the stage, right? That's not for somebody who was doing the same thing as they did to a presidential candidate who has government-funded Secret Service, and even so failed, right? But the cost of security of doing conservative events or putting together, of going to speak on campus for all of us is going to be astronomical, and it's going to push a lot of events are just not going to happen. Like the most high-profile ones will. But unless we really we do something both in terms of everybody giving to that effort and also on policy, we need to force the universities, for example, to bear the cost of this, because they are already, for the last 11, 12, 15 years, they have already been heaping it on conservative student organizations. And yes, there are a couple good cases, First Amendment cases in our back pocket. And despite that fact, universities have been using security costs as a way to stop conservative organizations from holding events for 15 years. Well, now they have a legitimate, it's legitimately going to cost $500K to have a controversial, quote unquote, provocateur, somebody who just states the views that the four of us hold on campus, it's going to cost $500,000. And the universities have to bear that cost. If they cannot bear that cost, then they certainly shouldn't be getting money from the taxpayer. And frankly, they should close up shop. If they can't protect, free speech on campus, and they can't protect the kind of civil debate that Charlie brought to those campuses, then they should just shut down tomorrow, because they're not able to do their jobs.
Yeah, I share the concerns that this is going to lead to more de facto censorship, and it's intolerable. And I think that policy prescription is the right way to go with the schools. Stepping back, I don't necessarily have an answer to what keeps this coalition together. What lessons do you take from Charlie, and then the practical infrastructure, and then pick it up and make it stronger and more durable and bigger and more powerful? To some extent, it may well be that the left ends up a victim of its own success and/or its own belief that it was dominant. And then when it's not as dominant as it thinks, then it lashes out in radical ways and violent ways, which makes it even less popular, notwithstanding that it will terrify some percentage of the population. But I think the left may have overplayed its hand because it felt it needed to, when we go back to the weaponization of these institutions and the trying to get Trump and everyone in his network thrown in jail. And by the way, as we're recording this today, of course, there's been disclosures that the so-called Arctic Frost FBI investigation, which basically was an attempt to claim that conservatism is a criminal conspiracy, and anyone involved in 2020 election challenges was part of that conspiracy. And the likes of, oh, by the way, Turning Point USA were targeted by that FBI effort. Yeah, they dominated all of these institutions, and they had no competition. They finally got competition, and they were afraid that it would pose an existential threat to them. So they literally took shots at Donald Trump, and they tried to criminalize and dismantle and destroy the conservative movement. They failed, and they continue to take the 20% or 10% position on 80-20 or 90-10 issues. And now they engage in political violence for all the world to see, that no rational, let alone even partially moral person could ever condone or rationalize or justify. And it may well be that they continue to ultimately marginalize themselves by going down these rabbit holes. But the bottom line is that a sizable percentage of the population, as I noted, is broken. And one thing that's worth noting that we haven't really touched on, and others may be able to speak with even more knowledge and having personally observed this, but Charlie professed his faith. He was devout, he was pious, and he was overt in expressing those beliefs. And at the end of the day, all of this comes back to, even if you can't necessarily tie one's political beliefs to the merits of the individual, this country, this experiment was created for a moral and a virtuous people, however flawed they may all be, and however much they have to strive to even achieve a modicum of acting morally and virtuously. And at the end of the day, a sizable percentage of the population is not there. Were we a moral and virtuous people, you would not have ghouls celebrating political violence in any number in this country. So Charlie's individual example serves as a model. And ultimately, we can win political battles. And obviously, politics can impact the culture, just like culture, conversely, can influence the politics. But he was working on trying to influence, future generations and probably deprogram future generations from the indoctrination they were getting in their schools and at home. But at the end of the day, it comes back to families and faith. And that is what ultimately changes the political trajectory and all the other trajectories. Otherwise, we're dealing with the consequences, and we may win battles dealing with the consequences, but ultimately still, do we win the political war at the end of the day? Are we still a republic at the end of the day? That's a question that remains a very open question going forward, even if the Democrats get their clocks cleaned for the next 50 years in elections. So still, I think at the end of the day, we have to be a moral and a virtuous people. And that transcends the political battles and the imperative to politically organize, which, of course, that imperative still no doubt exists. Winning elections is still absolutely vital. Winning the war of ideas is still absolutely vital. But there's something more fundamental that needs to be reclaimed as well. And I think that Charlie was a part of that project, but it's a long-term generational struggle. And I don't think it's at all clear yet who ultimately wins in that battle.
Will and Inez, any final thoughts?
I'm good. Nothing crazy at the moment. I think I said what I needed to say.
Yeah, I feel the same.
All right. Well, with that, first of all, I know we're all praying for Charlie's soul, for his family, for everyone at Turning Point, and really the country. But that's going to do it for us this week on NatCon Squad. On behalf of Will, Ben, and Inez, I'm Amber Duke. We'll see you next week.